So here we are back to a nice clean project manager with a properly imported and set up DaVinci Resolve 12 editing project. So hopefully you've got that all set. But we're going to put that aside for the moment because it's important to go into the creation of a new project and a little bit of project setup, just so you know how to get started from scratch. So again, to create a new project, we can either double-click the untitled project icon that appears by default when we first open Resolve, or we could click New Project, or we could right-click and choose New Project. You'll find very quickly that there are 3 or 4 ways of doing just about everything in Resolve, depending on what your mood is. So I'm just going to double-click Untitled Project. This opens up a fresh, clean, blank project. And before I do anything else, before we explore the rest of the UI, before we start importing clips, which is always step 1, the very first thing we want to do, step 0, is to open up the project settings, which are accessed via this gear icon in the lower right-hand corner of the overall Resolve UI. Click that. To open up the project settings, we just want to make sure that our project settings are correct for what we're going to be doing. So you'll notice that there are a lot of project settings. If you've already used previous versions of Resolve, there aren't a ton of changes over previous versions. There are simply a few more settings that have been added and a few more panels of organization. I'm going to focus on the high-level stuff, the top project settings that you really want to make sure you're aware of before you do anything else. And I will leave the rest for you to explore later on. At the very top, we've got the master project settings. That's the second panel that's available, and it's probably the most important panel in all of DaVinci Resolve. This defines the primary properties of any project in Resolve, starting with the timeline format box up at top. And timeline format contains, firstly, the timeline resolution. Now, this is something you can change anytime you want. DaVinci Resolve is proudly, completely resolution independent, which means that you can import clips of any resolution. You can use them in projects of any resolution. DaVinci Resolve is very good at using automatic behaviors and manual adjustments to deal with the discrepancies in size. But DaVinci Resolve is also really good at keeping track of the proper sizes of all of your clips, all of your transforms, and all of the windows that you create in color. Anything that has geometric properties, DaVinci Resolve will keep track of whenever you change the timeline resolution. So you can be working at 1920 by 1080 and then later on decide, you know what, I would rather jump this whole project to DCI scope. And DaVinci Resolve will automatically scale everything as best it can in order to make sure that everything is resized appropriately for the new resolution that you're working. And then later on, if you decide you want to go back to 1920 by 1080, you weren't really wanting to work at scope at all, you can simply go back. Whenever you make a change, you need to click the Save button, and that'll close the project settings and cause your changes to take effect. And this goes for the pixel aspect ratio as well. You have the option of altering the overall pixel aspect ratio for all clips in the timeline, and you can also assign specific pixel aspect ratios to individual clips once they've been imported. So Resolve is very good at keeping track of all those things. The timeline frame rate is something you can only change so long as no media has been imported into DaVinci Resolve. And that's important to understand. Once you import even one clip, and by the way, whenever you import a clip, DaVinci will automatically ask you if you want to alter the resolution and the frame rate to match the clip that you're importing. But as soon as you've imported a clip, that fixes the frame rate to whatever has been selected for the duration of that project's lifetime. You cannot have multiple timelines with multiple frame rates in DaVinci Resolve. Each project has a single timeline frame rate that is imposed upon the project, and that's the frame rate. Now, that doesn't mean you can't output to different frame rates. In fact, that is available, and you can use video monitoring video format to output different formats from the one used by the project and timeline. Now, by default, the video format matches the size and frame rate of what you've selected up in timeline format, but this can be changed to be different if that's something you need to do. For example, if you're working at 4K, but you want to monitor at 1080. Now, if I scroll down to the bottom of the master project settings, you'll notice in conform options, there's a mixed frame rate format pop up. So whenever I tell people that the timeline frame rate is fixed, usually the next question is, well, what happens if I have mixed frame rate clips that I want to combine in the same timeline? And the answer is, this is the frame rate of the timeline. However, DaVinci Resolve does understand and support mixed frame rates. And in fact, you can even choose how to interpret mixed frame rates, because it turns out different applications do the math differently. If I open this up, you'll notice there are options for Final Cut Pro 7, Final Cut Pro 10, None, and Resolve. So if you're importing a project from Final Cut Pro 7, use this option. Likewise, if you're importing a project from Final Cut Pro 10, use this option. And by the way, when you import projects, these will be set automatically for you. You don't have to set this up yourself. If you're bringing projects in from Media Composer or Premiere Pro, then you'll simply want to use the default Resolve method of mixing frame rates. And if you don't want to use mixed frame rates at all, if you want to make sure that every single clip is simply reinterpreted according to the number of frames in that clip, and that the original frame rate is ignored, in other words, clips will play in fast forward or slow motion, depending on how many frames there are, then you can choose None. However, for most users, I suspect Resolve will be the appropriate option to choose from this mixed frame rate format pop-up. And this pop-up also appears in the import dialog when you're importing EDLs or XMLs or AAFs. So moving back up to the top, image processing by default is set to 32-bit floating point. In fact, that's the only option. And this tells you how high quality DaVinci Resolve's internal image processing is. Everything Resolve does by default is at 32-bit floating point. Color science is something we'll get into a little later. This doesn't really have a huge effect on the editor. Lastly, enable video field processing is only important in projects where you're specifically importing interlaced media that you're going to be either transforming or filtering in some way. In other words, if you import interlaced media and you're going to use any of the sizing controls in DaVinci Resolve, or you're going to blur or sharpen those clips, then you should turn Enable Video Field Processing on. This allows DaVinci Resolve to basically split each field into separate frames and process each field as separate frames. So instead of, for example, if you're importing 2997 material, instead of processing 30 frames per second worth of material, Resolve will be processing 60 frames per second worth of material, but each frame is going to be alternating fields. And then Resolve puts that all back together when it renders out for final delivery. If you're not using interlacing, or you're not doing any sizing or filtering operations, you can leave this off and Resolve will work a little more swiftly. But if you're worried you're using interlaced material, you might want to turn that on. If you're not using interlaced material, there is no reason at all to turn this on ever. There's really not. So underneath, is video monitoring. If you've got a Blackmagic input-output device of some sort that you're connecting to an external display, these controls override the controls that are made available to your file system or your control panel, your operating system control panel, for controlling how video is output. In other words, these controls take precedence, and if I go back in the case of Mac OS X to my system preferences, the DaVinci Resolve controls override the Blackmagic desktop video controls. So these controls are irrelevant as long as I'm inside of DaVinci Resolve. So I have options for what kind of SDI output I want to use. I have options for how I want to configure SDI, single link, dual link, or quad. I have options for how I want to output the video or data levels. If you don't know what this means, don't touch it. Leave it set to video. I have options over what kind of video bit depth I want to monitor at. This defaults to 10-bit, which is high quality. However, if you're on a processing challenged machine, you can lower this to 8-bit, which will give you a little bit more performance at the expense of a little bit of banding in certain images with gradual gradients that won't be reflective of the actual image data in Resolve. That's just going to be a downsampled representation. However, if you're editing, maybe you don't care. This is a way to save a little bit of performance. You also have another performance increasing maneuver here, hide UI overlays for optimized playback. This makes sure that any overlays, any badges or wireframes or things that will appear in a viewer get hidden whenever playback happens. And that actually gives you a substantial increase in performance over leaving those badges be drawn on your video output. Conform options are really important if you're importing EDLs, and they're also really important if you're doing AAF workflows from and to Media Composer. So if you're importing and exporting AAF files, you're going to want to make sure that you turn on assist using real names, and you're going to want to set that to embedding in sourcelet file. This is very important to making sure your round trips with Media Composer work properly, if you're doing round trips with Media Composer. If you're simply importing media into Resolve and cutting it in Resolve, this really isn't going to help you or hurt you. So for you editors out there, this may not be super important, but if you are going to be importing a project, then you'll want to acquaint yourself with how these options work, because they can be pretty important. Moving down, image scaling. The main thing I want to direct your attention to here is this input scaling preset option. And this determines what to do when files you've imported for use in DaVinci Resolve don't match the frame size of your timeline. And you have 4 options that let you decide what to do. The default is to scale the entire image to fit. If you want to, by default, scale everything with a crop, you can choose that. So this is going to say, for example, scale a standard definition clip into a high definition frame size such that it occupies the whole frame, but the top and the bottom will be clipped off or cropped off as a result. You also have the option of doing a center crop with no resizing. This is useful if you're importing a project from another environment in which this kind of image scaling is done as part of the transform settings on a clip-by-clip basis. And at the bottom, stretch frame to all corners can be useful if you're dealing with anamorphic footage and you actually want to stretch it out so that narrower footage can fit into a wider frame size. We're going to leave this to scale entire image to fit. Another thing I'll point out is output scaling preset by default is set to match timeline settings. That's great if you're working in HD and your master project settings are set to HD. This is not so good if, for example, your master project settings are set to 4K and your video monitoring is set to HD. In that instance, having the output resolution be different from the video format resolution could cost you some performance. It's not ideal. If you're finding that you're in this situation, the easy thing to do is to turn match timeline settings off and to make sure you set your output resolution in the output scaling preset to match whatever resolution is set in video format. I'll turn that back on for now.